We'll talk about the golden thread tonight, and there's various bits and pieces with it. It's fairly new, and it can be a bit complicated. So, as Tash said, then feel free to ask your questions, and no question is too out there on this topic. We can throw some stuff out, and we can have a chat afterwards. That's not a problem at all. As we talked about a little there, just a quick bit about me. I'm Dan. I work full time for British Standards, and my role is basically to understand anything digital, data, modern methods of construction, speak to people in the industry, speak to government, understand what's happening and where we think BSI can help. So one of those areas was the golden thread, as an example. As mentioned, I'm currently Vice President Technical and am a Chartered Architectural Technologist myself. Part of the day-to-day role, I do things like look after the UK BIM framework. So if any of you do anything around building information modeling, ISO 19650, there's a good chance you've probably been on the UK BIM framework website, and I do a lot of the co-management of that alongside Anne Kemp at NEMA. For my own sins, I sit on a lot of BSI committees and have done some work in the background in a few different areas, writing standards, blog posts, other things, and maybe more relevant for today. I was one of the contributors to the CLC's guidance on delivering the golden thread. So hopefully we'll go through a few bits and we'll explain it as we go. That's a bit about me in a nutshell. Rough agenda. I'll also keep an eye on the chat, so if people do throw things in, we can pivot and move as we go. A couple of minutes on the introduction. I'll do a little bit of setting the scene, why things need to change, and then the big focus will be on what the golden thread is, which is that kind of intervention element in there, and then talk about what some of the benefits and the realizations from it. If you ever watched one of my presentations before, that's the same sort of SBIO is tend to be how I frame a lot of it. It'll make sense as we go. So the situation. Hopefully most of us know that what's coming on to now, I think gone 7 years, is that when those 72 people lost their lives, significant things needed to happen and change. As part of that, there were several independent reviews that were triggered. In particular, the one we'll focus on today is the one led by Dame Judith Hackett, where she created the interim review initially, and then did a final report afterwards, talking about effectively what went wrong and tried to catalogue things as robustly as possible to understand where some of the failings were in the way that we look and manage after our buildings, focusing on lots of different directions, try to work out where some of the key weaknesses are to try and encourage a new way of working. One of the quotes particularly out of it is this one I've put on the screen here. You can see that the current regulatory system is not fit for purpose in relation to high-rise and complex buildings. And you can see that when looking at it, this is why we've had that large reform through the Building Safety Act, where it's now in England been taken over by the Building Safety Regulator and the whole gateway process for anything that's deemed a higher risk building in that sense. Now, some of the behaviours that were talked about were quite interesting. You'll see I put little references in green on the slides. I'll give access to the slides afterwards so people can have a look, but effectively those are references to the documents that you can see hyperlinked at the bottom of the page. So if you wanted to do your own digging and double check into any of it, I tried my best to cite what's on my slides. You can see in here things like how the handover of fire safety information wasn't being followed as intended. Interestingly, when you talk to people about the golden thread and fire safety, ironically, a lot of it isn't new, and we've always had to do it. You look at the old various regulations that come out of the way the building regs were set up, you already had to provide fire safety information. But unfortunately, it wasn't either acted upon, and government neither actually tried to prosecute anyone with it. And there are no records of them actually going after anyone for failing to meet it. So not only was the regulation maybe not particularly known about, but it wasn't enforced either. So there were failings on both sides. But it's always been a legal requirement to provide relevant fire safety information. What they found is that the flow and evidence didn't provide an accurate public record. So there was lack of that kind of access and transparency to ensure that people can actually see whether building safety was being done or not. How would a resident know that their building was actually being properly looked after from a fire and structural safety point of view? And often that information was non-existent in that way, so that actually couldn't really get any transparency and understand it. And even when that information was being created, made, and looked after, there were many failings in that space. I don't think we've all heard or been witness to stories of contractors effectively compiling a large amount of design and construction information, effectively maybe scribbling over the top of it to create the as-built, it all being stapled together and then chucked in a basement somewhere, where it effectively never sees the light of day. But then from the date of handover, as the building is looked after, things are replaced, maybe small adaptations and stuff are done, that actual existing record of what's meant to represent as built isn't being maintained and looked after. And as such, then with that, a lot of it is incomplete, it's in paper form, and it's actually very difficult for to be accessed for those who need to see it. And because of some of these things, it meant that there were some different kind of outcomes being set out by Dame Judith in her reports, talking about things like it is unclear whether any changes have been made to that original design. So how confident can you be that the drawing that you have is actually accurate? When I worked for Cardiff Council, as a small anecdote, we used to have kind of CAD captures of a lot of our buildings, and they were maybe within a meter. It was dreadful. You couldn't trust that information, but it was all we had. So it's frightening to think what others may have actually had at the time. Building owners do not have any that kind of up-to-date information that's easily accessible to be able to manage the building. There are difficulties there of actually not being able to have it and trying to work out the impact any refurbishments may have had, particularly when it talks about things like fire compartmentation or other bits and pieces. Actually using accurate as-built to determine the effect that a refurbishment or adaptation may have had is quite critical, and often the right information wasn't there to actually ascertain whether it was being done and proper checks and balances were being put in place. As such, several recommendations were being made, and I haven't got enough slide space to go through all the recommendations, but the ones that are pertinent to the golden thread are some of the ones I've put on the screen here. This idea that government should mandate a digital standard for record keeping. They were unhappy with it being paper-based. We needed to go digital. That these digital records need to be in a format which is appropriately open and non-proprietary, i.e. they're not locked behind a vendor-specific format, and they needed appropriate security controls. The government would work with industry to agree what information must be held, as well as the type of information to be collected and maintained. They obviously had a pretty good idea, but what they need to do is work with us, to give us some agency in this space, but also to verify that their understanding was correct in the matter. The idea that duty holders would need to actually stand up with a hand up and identify where gaps existed. So similar to a CDM sort of aspect of it is that you can't, if you see an issue, you can't walk by, you're meant to put your hand up and report it. And this idea of you must be able to hold, transfer and update this information throughout the life cycle of that building. So it's not enough to just deliver it, you've got to be able to look after and edit and update that information too. So the intervention, what we were trying to do and create. As part of the wider programme, there was an awful lot of new regulations and kind of secondary statutory instruments being put in place. The largest regulatory reform we've probably seen in any of our respective lifetimes. So a massive shake-up in the way that things are working. And obviously we're just focusing on England here. Wales has got the Building Safety Act, but hasn't yet written its secondary legislation. Scotland has got its own way of doing things as well. So not only is there complexity in this large regulatory reform, but some of these acts apply to England only, some apply to England and Wales. They might differ to what's happening in Scotland. So it's a very complicated landscape to try and navigate. But we'll focus on the bits that are specific to the golden thread as we talk through it. And to try and help cut through some of that, there's also some guidance that have been written once all this pieces of instruments have been published. There's the actual building safety regulators guidance itself, so coming from the regulator. Fairly recently, the CLC published their guidance, which builds on the work from the Building Safety Regulator, and soon to be published is guidance from the Building Safety Alliance. That guidance has been written bearing in mind the CLC guidance, so hopefully it all works together homogeneously, where the building safety guidance talks more about how you can use it, particularly around using Uniclass to kind of help you manage some of that information, where the CLC guidance focuses more on what is the golden thread, what are the minimum legal duties, as well as then how you might look to start to address them. So very much focused on the scope of the responsibility at hand. Now, as I talked about, there are certain parts of these regulations talk about the golden thread in particular, and the ones we'll focus on are regulations 31, 32, and 38. When you look at it, it talks about this idea of what the golden thread is, and particularly it focuses on typically two terms. You've got golden thread and you've got golden thread information. And we'll talk about those as we go. There's a subtle difference to the two of them. The golden thread effectively being both golden thread information and the process to look after that information, while the golden thread information is the contents inside the golden thread. And you saw as part of Regulation 31, there were certain requirements that were put in there, two provisionally. The first is that a client, specifically names the client having to do this, needs to create an electronic facility to hold the golden thread of information, and they must ensure that persons involved in design and construction have access to golden thread information. Now, whether they defer that duty onto someone else and say ask you as part of your role as the design team to provide that on behalf of the client, that's certainly possible, but ultimately they are legally accountable for ensuring it happens. So actually, when engaging with your clients on higher risk building projects, ensuring that they know that it's their responsibility will be an important thing for them to understand. Now, the golden thread information itself, you can broadly split it into two parts. You've got the pieces of information that's needed for things like the gateway approval process, and you've got the prescribed documents that need to be produced as a minimum set to go into the golden thread itself. So in key building information, it talks about the type of information that's needed to be captured. So things like whether there are any ancillary buildings, things like the different materials used, so specifically, what material is the roof, the external walls, the bits and pieces made out of, are there any penetrations or protrusions in those spaces, details about how many stories there are, knowing that stories also go into the basement in that sense, number of staircases and that sort of thing. So effectively almost fields that you'd see on forms as you go through things. And then the prescribed documents being some of the ones I've got listed here, things like site plans, competence declarations, the construction control plan, mandatory occurrence reporting, and those sorts of things. If you want to know more about those documents, a good place to start is that CLC guidance, because it does talk a bit about the scope of those documents and what they're meant to cover. Now, why this is important to us as architectural technologists is that often we take the role of on the design side, and often after we can lead in that function as well. And specifically, when you look at what we need to do, often if we are appointed as the principal designer, we're then responsible for ensuring that the designs are stored appropriately in that golden thread. So any design information that needs to be there, we are ultimately accountable for making sure that information is not only there, but it is up to date. Which means then there has to be a level of kind of maintenance and observation on top of that as well. So ensuring that there's good lines of communication between us and say the structural engineering team or the multidiscipline kind of M&E team or whoever else might be working on the project is required, because if we are appointed as principal designer, we're accountable to ensure that all their design information is placed there. So having one team fail to deliver it, we may ultimately be accountable for that. So just know that that is one of the duties placed upon us if we are appointed as principal designer. Now, I guess the question of what it is probably something useful that we should talk about. Now, in the regulations themselves, they give you a list of these characteristics. And the way I'm going to talk through this is I'll tell you what the characteristics are, and then we'll sort of have a slightly deeper dive into each one to talk about what that sort of means or where there might be places for things to help. So at very least, this page is the must-do aspect of it, and anything I show you afterwards is kind of a way of doing it as part of that process. So the first is it's got to be kept in the electronic format. As mentioned before, unhappy with paper-based, it's got to be in some form of kind of computery electronic format in the way that it's been used. It has to be able to be transferred without loss or corruption. So interestingly, one is it's quite easy to prove that you can send something. It's slightly more difficult to prove that it hasn't lost any data when that's happened. So there are certain checks and balances needed to ensure that's right. It has to be accurate and up to date. It needs to be in a readable format, which is also intelligible for the intended readers. So when we're dealing with other design professionals, obviously there's a certain level of competence assumed for them, but if some of this information is also meant to be visible by residents, then we also have to take into account that actually people who aren't trained to read technical drawings may have to see some of this information, so you may have to deliver it in a way that you're not used to delivering information. It needs to be available as soon as reasonably practical following a request from a duty holder. So someone like a principal designer, principal contractor, the person ultimately responsible for the management afterwards, clients, those sorts of duty holders, if they request information, it needs to be delivered to them in a timely manner. Whilst it needs to be accessible, it needs to be secure. So actually safety considerations there to make sure that things are suitably either encrypted or put behind password protected systems, and the balance that's put in thereafter. The idea that there's certain procedures in place to record when changes happen. So if someone updates a drawing, knowing who's done that update and what has been updated as part of that process. I thank you for the question, Nathan. I'll get onto that in about a slide or two's time about some of the file formats. But as Nathan's done, feel free to drop things in the chat and I can deal with them as we go through. The idea that having consistent language and terminology is quite important as well. If you think there are tens of thousands of files being generated on these sort of projects, actually using terminology consistently is something that is being carefully considered, particularly as when you have to read things across several documents, having that consistency in language is important. And due to the fact that there are so many files there, this idea that it needs to be a way of actually having a file structure that is kept, and when files are indexed, given some sort of file naming convention or similar, that indexing is preserved in the way that it's looked after. So even to the point of what you name files or what classification systems and metadata you have on them is pretty important. So those come from the regulations you see there, and that's mostly come from regulation 31, with that last one sneaked into regulation 38 there as part of that process. So onto formats first. It ultimately has to be electronic and readable. I've got some jokey XKCD slides here to convey a couple of points to you, but it's actually really hard to pick good file formats to do things in. The first is ensuring that what you have can last the test of time. Famously, things get unsupported on the internet. Google is a great example of a company that if someone isn't using something, they'll kill it and get rid of it. So ensuring that you can actually hold something in a data format that's readable in 25, 30, 40, 50 years is actually very difficult and needs an awful lot of consideration. And when you think about it, traditionally in a kind of physical world, we used to rely on things like microfilm and microfiche. I was talking about some of my council days earlier. We had a library of historic drawings on microfiche. I'd sit there on the old scanner to bring them up and then print screen them to chuck them somewhere, and to try and extract some of that information. But the point was that we actually had these microfiches that were, 50 plus years old. But when you think of it now, how many of you are sat here on a device that can use a CD or a floppy disk or a DVD or a Blu-ray? Because my laptop doesn't have any drive for any of that sort of thing right now. And in fact, many of us who might work on secure projects, Often you can't even use your USB ports. From a kind of a cybersecurity, cyber essentials sort of point of view. So actually getting something on a flash drive is proving quite problematic these days. Um, in terms of that, then you also look at things like, well, do you hold it in apps? But also apps need to be developed and looked after and maintained. Several of those have also sort of died in history in that sort of way. Things like we're seeing how Java is more or less solely been shut down for the use of things like HTML5 and stuff on the internet. And Flash has disappeared in that sort of sense as well. So really, the only thing that currently seems to stand the test of time has been things like PDF, CSV, and text files. So we'll have to see how those things sort of go. And we also got to remember it needs to be non-proprietary. So handing over that information in Revit is not going to be suitable. Because if whatever day the Autodesk stops supporting Revit, there won't be licenses and you may not actually be able to view those files. So ensuring that you can open that file in 30 years cannot be guaranteed if you use a proprietary format. But this is where things like DXF is technically an open format. So DXF is one way you can get around that. IFC is another in that sort of way. But again, it's about ensuring that there's availability using some sort of viewer or not to ensure that you can have access to that information. And in the same way, jokingly, there's a trustworthiness aspect to this. Like you can see sort of jokingly on here, if you were sent information in a GIF, you probably wouldn't believe it. But actually, when we're talking about important information, there are certain sort of file formats where it can be thought of as more trusted and more authoritative in that way. So as technologists, we have an ability to share things in a range of ways. Our drawings can be shared as image files, as PNGs, as JPEGs, as those sorts of things, as well as in DXF or in PDF and others. So that we have options, but it's knowing what is the most appropriate thing, both to ensure that it's accessible, but also that it can be opened and understood by the reader who actually might not have access to a free CAD viewer or something like that in that way. Thank you, Tim, for the question on the common data environment. That will come up later, so bear with me for that. In terms of formats as well, we generally think of information in two ways. The first is that you get structured information, whether be it semi-structured or fully structured, and there are solutions that are trying to look at that. Things like building logbooks, building passports. You may have heard a lot around digital product passports as well, as been talked a lot about in Europe at the moment. Products often now come with data sheets. So whether that we can look at things like a built-in data sheet in that same sort of way, where effectively it's in tabular form that can be saved in PDF or similar. Using something like IFC, I already talked about, which is an open format from Building Smart, is a way to do it. You have things like Kobe, which is effectively the Excel subset from IFC, or so to say the spreadsheet subset in that, and then maybe more specific iterations like Fiery, which is almost like a more fire specific version talked about in one of our British standards. And then at the same time, you get things like documentation, various different files in that sort of way. And one thing I'll point you guys to is something that could be helpful is this technical report that we've published, TR 22299, which actually gives recommendations for file formats for long-term storage. So it doesn't talk about, it's a generic one, so it doesn't talk about CAD files specifically. I'm actually talking to them in the near future to see if I can expand it into more digital stuff. But it tells you, if you're saving an image, GIFs and JPEGs and PNGs are great. If it's in 3D graphics, some sort of step file works really well. And actually IFC is based on step. So there's a pretty good kind of direction there, for things like Office documents. It mentions things like OpenOffice XML, which is the Microsoft file format where it has the little X at the end. So things like DocX, SLSX, PPTX, and those sorts of things. They are technically open file formats. So they're pretty good, as well as things like ODF and things that you might see in OpenOffice or LibreOffice, and the good old PDF. Little known fact as well is that PDF has different versions. So you've got PDF-A, which is like an accessible PDF, and you've got PDF-E, which is an engineering PDF, where it's pretty good at actually holding things like layer information and those sorts of things as well. So there are also lesser known sub-formats that can be quite useful for ensuring long-term storage as part of that process. So bear these sorts of things in mind when ensuring that you can deliver stuff that not only that you deliver, but also needs to be maintained as well. A key point it talked about was this idea of it being transferred without loss or corruption. This means really some sort of testing needs to be done. Now, 19650, which is effectively the suite of the ISO standards around BIM, talks about this a little because it talks about this idea of having a mobilization phase and a mobilization plan where you might actually send test files to different systems to see if all the information shows up first before you actually launch into the full project. So I've seen examples of this where people have almost shared like a simple cube or some small pieces and then tested whether they can export out all the information they want from their design software into an open format into the asset management system. And actually doing these sorts of tests first can help give people confidence that what is being shared is done so without that loss or corruption. At the same time, then, when you look more specifically into 19650 Part 4, it requires it. So if you're working on a project, there's any sort of BIM 19650 requirements on it, you have to look into this sort of thing anyway. And one helpful place to look might be Building Smart, because they do actually list software that are certified for importing or exporting for IFC. So if you were looking at that as a solution, at least you would have a third party you could point to who says, well, this software is meant to be able to share it in a way that's without loss and corruption if I use it properly, which might help give some third party some confidence in the matter. Ensuring it's accurate and up to date. So we had the question come through from Tim about actually the relationship to things like the common data environment. And I think this is where that sort of concept can help for it to work. The idea of the common data environment, when it was first proposed, was a way of could people share information often in a safe environment where they wouldn't get that kind of legal hammer thrown at them because you can flag things as being work in progress, or it's there just for you to compare spatial coordination aspects and other things. So it was a way to encourage that kind of frequent and often sharing between design teams. It was meant to help with communication and collaboration. So in that same way, it can be used to help ensure information is accurate and up to date. And it does so specifically through having both a revision code mechanism and a status code system in there. If you're fairly new to this idea, don't worry about it too much. I can send some resources through afterwards that go through it in a bit more detail. But this idea that you can sort of tag files with what you're allowed to use them for. So if it had an S0 on it, it's effectively my private document that no one else should be able to look at. If you want someone to be able to use it as an underlay for your own design, then an S1 might be appropriate there. So for example, if you wanted to get the grids off the structural engineer or the column locations, you might ask for them a file so you can coordinate off it. They might not have fully spec'd out the actual structural elements, but they're able to actually give you that massing to say, well, don't stick a door here, sort of thing. In the same way, then, stuff that you might give out for residents in terms of maybe you set out some drawings that show some of the fire strategy plan. They effectively be for information. They're not to be used as drawings per se, but they convey information that you want to communicate to someone. And then there are various codes then about when it goes through certain review processes to be checked off. So you can ensure that the right people have actually done the sign-off processes to ensure that information is current and accurate. So as part of it, there are checks and balances to ensure that this information is accurate if you happen to use those sorts of processes. So, once again, which might be a common theme of this presentation, following the information management kind of processes that BIM's introduced, will encourage kind of good working practices for satisfying the golden thread and the golden thread's information. Making sure information is both available and secure. So there are lots of kind of different aspects to this. The first is when you look at the way that information is exchanged, different people may take the lead at different parts of the process in terms of when information is shared. As per the figure you can see on the slide, in the early stages of a project, before design's even been undertaken, a lot of that information is actually being shared by the client. As we get into the design phase, it might be, an architectural technologist team working as the principal designer, structural engineers, others who are developing that design information. Then it might lead into the tier one acting as the principal contractor and their SEBIs as part of that. And then ultimately goes down to the people who look after the building in that sort of way. So there are phases, but there's always the smaller interplays of information being shared in between. And you can see that those effectively are captured as several milestones on that circular diagram, effectively aligning, more or less to that kind of RIBA kind of unified plan of work sort of stages. That effectively there will be some sort of concept design kind of cutoff and key exchange, some sort of scheme design one, which probably aligns with sort of planning submission sort of aspects as you go through it, ultimately to construction and sign off. So there are several key exchange points where you share information. It's not just within the team, but it's to relevant stakeholders externally as well. I've already mentioned people like town planning and building control, but also things like exchanging information with fire engineers and fire specialists, maybe specialist sub-consultants and others as well. So there's a wider group that are involved in that exchange as it goes. One way of thinking of it is that you have these sort of stakeholders that you want to share that information with, and you could either give them direct access to effectively your electronic document management system, the piece of technology you're using as your common data environment, where you can sit there and say, well, actually, they can have access to some of the files in the published space, or what could happen is that there's some sort of local storage that's kept aside, almost like a premises information box, but a digital equivalent of that, where you kind of keep information outside of that overall system, but put it together in some sort of space. It's not so specific in the regulations in terms of which is the best way. So there are open processes there that you can follow, but you can see a way that kind of process with common data environments in 19650 can lend its way to help ensuring that availability and security. On the flip side is making sure that it's suitably secure. One way of doing this is classifying information to ensure that it's handled correctly. There are various different systems for this that a client may already have and specify. This is one from a British standard, so you could always use this one if you haven't got another one. But this idea that starting from the bottom, files that are classified as public, can be stored anywhere but need to be suitably backed up. The idea that files that are for internal use only should only be used in controlled locations and should not be kept locally. So it shouldn't be on your desktop or somewhere else. It needs to be saved on a central place. And then as you go up the higher bits, documents start to be tagged. At that point, the actual document says on the front page limited. When it starts to get to those limited bits, at that point, it's people who have signed some sort of contract or NDA, and there's actually a distribution list. You know exactly who has had copies of those files. It goes up even higher than to sensitive, where you actually mark every single page as sensitive. You have that specific circulation list, and you might even use a kind of secret code for the project, Project Alpha or something like that. So it's not obvious from the document's cover or preview or the file name what it actually alludes to. And then you get to highly sensitive, where you start to do things like having encrypted forms, use some form of very secure kind of download process where you can't even attach it as an email. You send a link for someone to register to a website to then effectively record their download of that information. So depending on what it is, it could have those different levels of security to ensure that it has the right level of access. And bear in mind, if you're thinking of stuff that might go to residents, you may be starting to think of that more down that public internal space. But when you're talking about, fairly complicated bits around, fire and life safety, it actually could get a bit more into that kind of limited and sensitive side. And obviously, if there's any form of personal identifiable information or kind of corporate information and sensitive stuff, whether that complex project actually has a relation to some sort of key security aspects, all those things have to be considered in there as well. Recording when things have changed. We know that seldom seen is a project where you draw it once, everyone thinks it's perfect, carries on as it is. If you ever seen the drawing to design squiggle, I think it's a very good representation of what design looks like. And in that way, things ultimately will be revised, withdrawn, improved, iterated as part of that process. And there needs to be a way to manage that. Now, there are different processes that talk about it. 19650 talks a little bit about ensuring that there's an audit trail. So when you look at 1950 Part 1, it talks about this idea of the archive and the archive journal, where the journal actually keeps a record of those things. But you also have things like the European standards on document management. And they actually have specific clauses about them, about how you do things like create documents, use them, revise them, archive them, and maybe more importantly, how you delete them as well. So just a small excerpt I've chucked on the screen there. You can see that, it talks about before it can even be approved, there has to be some form of version control. And that version control has to be in accordance with the quality management system that organization has. So you start to get into the realms of actually what does the quality management system for your business say when it comes to document versioning and approvals, and aligning those things up. Interestingly, in a past life, I actually audited people on BIM and 19650, and one of my favorite things to do was to look at people's title blocks, look for the amount of signatures that should be on it, and ask them how that relates back to their ISO 9000, because quite often their quality management certification would dictate that there needs to be a second signee or something on some of them, but the title block might just say drawn by and actually didn't have a reviewed by or approved by box in there, despite it being a requirement to record these things in their document management system. So there are interesting ways of just ensuring you're doing what you already say you're meant to be doing. Consistent language. It's a real bugbear as we move things, I guess, more and more computerized. It's easier to catch and kind of start to interpret some of these things. Often they might not be that important on the face of it. I've seen duty holder spelt as one word or spelt as two words, but at the same time, it gets very precise when you think of things like there's a principal designer under CDM, which is different to the principal designer under the Building Safety Act. So being consistent with who you refer to as the principal designer, because those could be two different people or organizations, as an example, as well as what you call things. Are doors doors or are they door sets? Do they include the frame and everything else? When you're talking about things like U value, do you really mean thermal transmittance, or is it thermal conductivity? Is it the lamp? And all those sorts of things where we use technical language quite a lot, but ensuring it's consistent in the way that we use it helps both us as designers, the other design teams we communicate with, and also people like clients, residents, and others, larger stakeholders who have to engage with that content. One place that can help is that we actually have a set of term definition standards for construction from BSI, the ISO 6707 series. And what's great about them is you can go to the online browsing platform. So you see the link at the bottom, iso.org/OBP, and you don't have to pay anything. You can go on that and search for terms and definitions, find those standards, and you can actually pull up all the definitions from them. So you can see there, for example, I've just pulled up the definition for things like site and earthworks. That you can see out of part 1 that tells you, what a site is in essence in that way. So, having consistent vocabulary in the same way that's important to have consistent symbols just aids with people understanding the information that we create and maintain. Filing structure and indexing. So I think we're on the final, the main points here. Hopefully any of you who've been involved with things like BIM and 19650 will be fairly familiar with the file naming convention in the annex of that. What it does is it supports a structured way of identifying documents, and helps then with effectively indexing those documents themselves. So it scores 2 points in this space. I've got an example there, and my age-old trick with these things is to read them backwards. So if we were to read this one backwards, you can see it's the first A for architect, so the first architectural, D for drawing, the first architectural drawing, 00 is the ground floor, so it's the first architectural drawing of the ground floor across multiple volumes by company X for project 7012. And actually in that backwards kind of way of interpreting it, it can be quite easy to read it, as long as you're aware of what some of those codes mean. But we're not just dealing with files, we're dealing with the information inside those files as well. And there are other indexing systems that are available. One comes from the ISOs for designation systems, the 4157 series, which actually gives you rules for room naming. Hopefully none of you will panic, because the room naming convention is what everyone thinks it is, which is you put a number at the start, which is the floor, and then you go around effectively the floor then. So, room 201 will be on the second floor, sort of thing. But you also have this idea of designating parts of buildings, or you kind of products or elements in that sort of way. So what you might do is you might say what an object is, and then whether it's a type or an instance, as I've done here. So you could have door type A, door type B, and then door 1 could be door type A, and door 3 might be door type B, where door type A is an external door, where then it's an internal fire door is like a door type B, and then things like window 1. But in the same way, you can have column 6 and those sorts of things in there. So it's a fairly kind of plain language way of doing it, but it provides that consistency so that when you then cite cite those products and other documents, say the design specification, or in some data sheets, or when you export it out into door and window schedules, you've got that same consistency throughout. So you can cross-reference the drawing to the others, and they use these same designators. And that's been asked for to ensure that actually you can read across documents and get the sense out of them. So ultimately, what is this trying to achieve? We talked at the start some of the things that Dame Judith and the independent review was concerned about. They were unclear whether changes had been made to the original design, and hopefully you can see that with things like the common data environment, that audit process, the idea of the check review aspect to it, and that log means that you can see the changes in the original design if any changes have been done. So mechanisms have been put in place to try to help with some of that. Building owners did not have the required up-to-date information. Well, hopefully now we're aware of how we can actually manage access and keep information up to date. And actually that is our responsibility, if appointed as principal designers, to ensure that design information is kept accurate and up to date. And when it came to things like a refurbished building, it can be difficult to ascertain what effects any changes may have on building safety. And hopefully then with documents like the safety case, risk registers, and the whole set of plans, what products were their design intent being recorded in them, and other bits and pieces, will allow people to have that more informed choice of what happens, because that information will be available to them in a ready to access digital form. So in summary, and then we'll open up to any further questions. The regulations tell you that you've got to create and hold golden thread information. It consists of things like key building information, as well as documents, which include things like the safety case and the fire and emergency file. Many of these requirements you can do by just following good information management. So any of you who are doing BIM or looking at doing BIM, it'll actually help you a lot with the processes of creating and maintaining a golden thread. And ultimately, there are several standards that are available that can support with some of these, as well as guidances that are available, like the CLC guidance and the upcoming Building Safety Alliance guidance on the golden thread as well. Hopefully that was informative and useful. I appreciate there was an awful lot of information there, so some of you may be in the midst of absorbing, but as I mentioned, what I'll do is I will provide a copy of the slides to the region so they can be shared out to those who have attended. The recording will obviously be there, I think, for people to revisit as well, and people can always just email me or ask questions afterwards. But I can see some questions appear to be being written up as I waffle on. So we'll see what comes in. Likewise, if people want to skip the queue, I don't know if it's allowed normally, but I wouldn't be against people putting their cameras on and maybe unmiking themselves to ask a question.
Yeah, that's fine. You can open up the floor. I know you like a discussion, so feel free. Yeah, so you guys who are typing, if you just kind of want to ask a question, feel free to kind of ask away.
Stop typing then. I mean, obviously, I'm a big BIM fan, but I know it's quite a challenge to go and get the clients to go and buy into using that. So obviously, under the Building Safety Act requirements for the client, is this sort of expected to actually going to go and be a big driver towards using BIM now?
I think yes. So I mean, being cheeky about it, but people would say before, why should I do BIM? And you could say, well, it would help save you money, it might be efficient. Now, if people say, why should I do it? You can say, well, it might keep you out of jail. Which I think is a much more powerful driver when they have specific duties. And as I said, it's written, the client is accountable for ensuring this digital record is created and used. And if it isn't those characteristics we talked about, accessible, secure, up to date, all those sort of things, it doesn't meet the definition of what they've asked for. So if if at a point something happened and it was pulled back, they could go to jail for it. So I think it's a very powerful driver to say that if you want to, not be legally culpable, you may be interested in looking at this process.
I think the other thing I was quite interested in, it comes back into the CDE again, is that how obviously we've got sort of CDE for running the project, and at the end of the project we've got our asset information model being transferred over into use by facility managers and so on. How do we, is there a sensible way of granting like residential access to that? Because I think one of the ideas with the golden thread is that we're meant to go and be inspiring greater confidence for residents and safety in the building. But I'm still trying to get my head around how that would actually work with the CDE.
Well, it's a good question, and the way I've seen some do it is that what you actually end up having is that you have multiple platforms that get used as part of the CDE. So effectively, there's almost what they might call a project CDE, which might be effectively the one that was the contractor or the design team starts and uses in that sort of way. But there'll be an asset common data environment at the end, like an AIM CDE, which is the place where the client ultimately looks after it. And you think actually that's the place they probably want to create the access port for the residents and Joe Public in that sort of way, because of the way that that connection takes place then perpetually afterwards. Because obviously when the project shut down and someone turns the keys off to the project one, it'll no longer be accessible. So you could, of course, offer the project one to remain in perpetuity, and then someone has to pay for the rights of maintaining and keeping the seats live for it and everything else. So there's always flexibility in these things, but the more and more often, at least what I'm seeing, is that people are having multiple systems running, and it's about making sure those systems can talk to each other to allow for that seamless handover.
Is there any hope that that might actually be created at the government level, where we just end up having a portal to go and sort of submit information, and that can be stored and sort of given access to as sort of assets sort of change hands? Because I can see that working well for, say, like public sector bodies, housing associations, local government, and so on. But when we come into commercial, that's a bit more challenging, isn't it?
It is, and I think it's worth noting that government doesn't need everything that a building maintainer will need to look after the building. So obviously a great example is that the safety case report is a summary of all the safety case information that's needed. As part of the gateway process, they're asking for the safety case report. So there will be files effectively on your part of your golden thread that you don't submit as part of the gateway process, that they don't need as part of the gateway sign off, that someone else does need to maintain their duty and do it. So, even then, it would be an onus on them to create this public data bank of building information stuff that holds things that they don't necessarily need because they don't do the day-to-day management of those buildings. So if infeasible, it could work, but I know it won't go down that avenue, I think, for those sort of reasons.
Is this something that's likely to be kind of written into legal deeds and things like that? Obviously, with it being a responsibility of the client kind of going forward. I don't know if that's been done at the moment, but obviously if you've got to keep up to date information and pass it on, like everything, I'll get to a certain point where it's on you. But if it's not kind of picked up going forward, there's obviously that potential for it to be lost. So it's kind of like, how do you force people? And I suppose the only way you force people is by it becoming legal.
And and this is largely the lesson from the Building Safety Act, which was almost, we trusted you guys to do it properly. We did our independent review, found out you don't do it properly. So now we've had to regulate to make sure you do it properly. Is kind of the short version of it. And bear in mind, government were also blamed in the independent review, so they didn't do their job properly either. But they've set up a whole new regulator and stuff to try and for them to be proper.
So that's obviously the first part of the project, isn't it? Like when we're kind of taking our projects through site and we're all looking after it and it's going to the different people, it should be kind of looked after in the right ways, and the right person should be looking and signing off the right different appointments. But obviously when it goes further down the line and it goes into facilities management, it obviously then can be lost in lots of different ways, whether people obviously keeping that information up to date and then it sits with a client, or does it sit with the facilities manager? So it's just kind of, what's the thoughts in terms of I know there's a legal requirement, but is there still a way that it may be lost?
Yep, I mean, you're right. There are frictions there, but this is where good engagement with the asset management team at the end is really important. And one of the standards that's one of the key BIM standards is BS 8536, which is designed for operability, which is basically a standard that says involve FM early, have FM in design meetings and key decisions. And part of it was to make sure you don't build a plant room that they can't walk around in. Because classically you need to be 7 foot tall, but only 4 inches wide, I think, to get around some plant rooms. But it will apply in this instance as well, of being able to say to them, look, well, you have to look after all this afterwards. Do you want it as an IFC file? And they sit there and go, well, actually, we don't know what IFC is and can't use it. It's no good to us. Can we just have them as DXFs and exploded drawings or do whatever? You'd be like, okay, well, at least I know what you want now, and we can work out what that is. But it's that classic of actually having to speak to people. I'm conscious, I've seen Lewis's question in the chat as well. So Lewis is asked about, is it a requirement on all building types or just HRBs? And I'll say that the golden thread bit we've talked about today is only a requirement on HRBs, specifically the golden thread bit. But when I talked earlier about some of the older regulations that are still in place, those were for all building types effectively as well. So the old classic regulation 37, reg 38 sort of stuff, that wasn't specific to higher risk buildings. So you had a requirement of sharing pertinent fire information in 37. I think 38 was pertinent like ventilation and power information, I think. But you had certain requirements there that you had to send over. And the interesting one is that they are potentially revisiting the definition of higher risk building as well, because there's been a lot of criticism about it being due to how tall the building is. There's also talk about Wales hasn't yet done its definition for high risk building and says it's going to be broader and more, substantive. So even though you might work in England, if you're doing a project off in Wales, they might have a different definition for higher risk building later. So it's, I think, worth considering, because some of these changes affect all building types and some of them only affect higher risk buildings. And a really good example of a subtle change, and I won't remember any of it right, but you get the spirit of it, is it used to be a requirement for record keeping. It was 6 years under hand or 12 years under seal was the old rule for how long you had to keep records for. But they changed, I think it's the Defective Premises Act. I don't know if that's the right wording for it, but effectively, as long as a building is almost in use, you are required to keep information about that building in case there's an issue with it and that information needs to be called upon. So in changes to these regulations, when there's now a bit where actually you have to maintain that record as long as that building's around, or else then you could be done in that sort of way then that they might think it's your fault and you don't have the documents to prove why it isn't your fault. So small changes here and there into the regulatory regime means that some of this is either applicable or very useful to have to protect yourselves, even if you aren't working on higher risk buildings. And I think, as we talked about earlier, a lot of it is in tune with doing some of the BIM stuff, which can be a condition of funding from certain organizations or pots. I know that some frameworks require it, and obviously it's a question for a lot of the pre-qualification stuff. If they've used Build UK's questionnaires, they all have lots of BIM questions in there as well. So depending on the type of projects you're bidding for, actually you may have to do some of this, not because it's a building safety thing, but because you're having to do the BIM stuff. So it's a bit of a cop-out, Lewis, but hopefully that gives you enough of an answer there. I can't see any more for any more yet.
No, I think we're okay. There's quite a lot to digest, to be fair, even just to think of it as just information exchange and kind of going through everything. And even just thinking about that on a daily basis in terms of files that you receive yourself with information where things are missing or there's no drawing information. I suppose we should get to a point somewhere in time where, in theory, there should never be any information missing. We should always kind of have the information for the building.
No, we should. And there is
a nice place to be.
I'll stop sharing and I'll show something really interesting in a second that talks about that. This is bonus content, but it's only because it's the best thing I've probably ever seen. There is if you've never been to it, it's a fascinating website. There's an organization called GIRI, which is the Get It Right Initiative. I appreciate I say that with a Welsh twang. So GIRI do a lot of surveys and they pull some stuff together. So it's a very useful place to go. And what they have is actually some good reports. One of their reports, their research one, actually went into like the root cause of failure on construction projects. So they basically went to contractors and stuff. Well, there we are. It's already knows what page I want because I go on it all the time. And they actually surveyed a bunch of people. Oh, it's going to move now. After I just gave it all that credit. After they basically went in and talked to people, said, look, why did this problem happen on your project? And you can see that the biggest one was poor planning. The old poor planning leads to poor performance, late design changes, bloody client coming in and changing everything in the last minute. But then you get to poorly communicated design information being the third biggest factor in why problems go wrong. And if you go around the circle, you've also got incorrect design information, you've got inadequate attention paid to the design, you've got poor interface between two people, poor communication, information overload, so too much information. So it's interesting how much the information side of it is blamed for problems that happen in that sort of way. So it's a fascinating thing to look at, as you say, in terms of just trying to do it right. And because I'm a mean person, whenever I go to an end of year show, often I'll see the drawings from some of the students, and there'll be this really nice call out detail they've done for something, and I'll be like, oh, that's good. I said, who's going to read that drawing? And they'll be like, what do you mean? I say, well, you've made that drawing. Who's going to use it? And they can't tell you who's going to use it. And I say, well, so what information off that drawing are they going to need to use? Because often the dimensions will be tiny, or there'll be this floating wall somewhere that doesn't actually reference where it sits in relation to the overall site plan. And so they're going, right, so we're going to build this wall. You tell me how I'm going to use this drawing to build that wall. So a fault that I think we often have is that we draw things that we think people need, but we don't necessarily talk to the people we're going to give them to work out, is this actually the information that they want? And a weird life story was I kept specifying, I think, leader flush Shapland all the time for all my sanitary ware, and none of the projects in Cardiff used it because there was a local company that made sanitary ware they all used because it was like quarter of the price. And they always use them. They didn't change because of tendering and value for money rules and all that sort of jazz. So once I found out about that, I just started speccing them instead, because at least then I had the right sizes, I had the right interfaces. Because if they're going to use them anyway, why would I keep putting the wrong stuff in there? And I think sometimes there's a bit of hubris that we just need to cast aside and go, you know what? If this is what they want to see, then at least now they know what pieces to order from the one they always go to. And I think we maybe fall foul of not talking enough to the supply chain to work out who's using our drawings and what for.
I agree. We've got, in fact, it's one that's been bantered about the last week in terms of practice, especially when forming our briefs and kind of the output that comes out is kind of good information, gives good design. Obviously, if you've got poor information, design quality tends to be quite poor as well. So yeah, I think that's a nice place to round up unless anyone's got any more questions. So I just want to say thank you to everyone for attending, and thank you to Dan for giving up your time today to come and talk to us.